Michael Parker is the author of 7 novels and 3 collections of short stories. He has received fellowships from the North Carolina Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. And he is a 3-time winner of the O. Henry Award for Short Fiction. Quick interruption, I've been told that the part of the bio I'm about to read is out of date and it will be corrected afterwards. Just wanted to make that clear. Parker is the Nicholas and Nancy Vacc Distinguished Professor in the MFA Writing Program at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and divides his time between North Carolina and Austin. Please welcome Michael Parker.
I did tell her to leave that in so I could say I recently retired and everyone would feel sorry for me and buy my book because of fixed income. What a pleasure it is to read with Laura, who I've known for so long, and since 2004 maybe, and we've never read together. And I just have to say that The Mother Who Stayed is one of the finest books I know in American literature. So subtle, so careful, so profound, so sly, so funny, so devilish, so, I keep coming back to the word careful because you don't read sentences and you don't read books that are that well made often these days. And so I insist that everyone who does not have a copy go out and buy one, and those of you who do have a copy, get another one. Because and I love that you read about moving to Texas. I have to say that it took longer to get a Texas driver's license than it did for me to write this book. Actually, I was in line. I think I was just 7.5 hours in line on Thursday. So I said to the woman next to me at one point, she lived in my neighborhood, so we've been doing the neighborhood chat thing. And finally I said, I'm getting a little, this seems like a little long, 7.5 hours. And she said, one of the things about becoming a Texan is that you need to learn to endure. Okay. I don't know what I expected. But anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read, I want to thank Malvern for having us. And also, is this new? This part?
No.
I've never noticed. It's very Twin Peaksy. I've never noticed it before. So I'm going to read just a very short section from an essay that I wrote about the book. I'm going to ask you to write an essay about the book that they include in a little promotional thing. And I'm always resistant to that because I think they want you to write a little bit about sort of the inspiration behind the book and where the book came from. But I always think if you know where art comes from, then it must not be very good maybe. And sometimes you get people who explain where things come from and they go into great detail and you think, really? If you had it all planned out, why would you do it? The best, one time, maybe it was couldn't have been an O. Henry, maybe it's Best American, sorry. But the playwright Edward Albee had been asked where a story came from, and he seemed so befuddled by the question that he wrote. I went to a cocktail party, I saw a man talking to a woman. That was all he said. That was my favorite. But I have a little bit more to say about this, so I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to read just a few pages from the novel, and then we can do something else. It's called Lone Wolf, Oklahoma, which is where the book is primarily set. And I should ask, is there anyone in here who's from Oklahoma? Oh, good. No, I love Oklahoma. It's my new favorite place. Because I've only been there once. I never knew my maternal grandmother. She died just days after I was born. And because the man she married, a Presbyterian minister whose Calvinist streak and patriarchal ways tended toward overshadow, lived until I was in my mid-teens, I never heard very much about her. But the couple of things I did know about her made her seem exotic. The first, she came from Lone Wolf, Oklahoma. My grandfather, the preacher, had been born in South Carolina, but came to his senses and moved at an early age across the state line to Gastonia, North Carolina. My people on my father's side had been in North Carolina since their arrival in America, as far as anyone can tell. They weren't great record keepers, and they had a talent for disappearing. My great-uncle Charlie stole a train, idling on its siding by a sawmill, drove it to the end of the tracks, and was never seen nor heard from again. There is speculation that he was shot dead by a man whose daughter he had gotten in the family way, or that he went to Texas, fates that are always delivered as if they are equal. Oklahoma brought to mind, of course, the musical, but once I got over that association and got the corny song out of my head, I thought of dust storms and sod houses, treeless prairie, and wronged Cherokee. I grew up in eastern North Carolina on the edge of the Little Kahari Swamp. In late spring, the piney woods came alarmingly alive with scrub and weed, so lush that shoots and tendrils seemed to creep into the yard while I watched. Land was cleared for tobacco and produce, but beyond the cultivation, the dark mouth of forest loomed. Woods were everywhere and shadowy with secrets and hideouts. An Oklahoma vista seemed lunar. The second thing my mother told me about her mother was even more evocative. In the harsh winters of the prairie, with nothing but fence posts for thousands of miles to stop the wind, my great-grandmother sent my grandmother and her older sister to school on the back of a horse, pinning heavy blankets around them and slapping the horse, who knew the way to the school. When they got there, the teacher would unpin them, stable the horse, and repin them in their cocoon for the trip home if the weather necessitated it. I know a couple other things about my grandmother, but it was a horse story that stuck with me. I wrote a 3-page story about it and published it in a book of similarly short stories, but it was the only story in that collection that I felt needed to be longer. Then a couple of people said to me, you know what, that story about the 2 girls on the back of a horse, it needs to be longer. It's easy to ignore such criticism from one reader, but 2 would be critical mass. I had no clue, however, that I was writing a novel about the relationship between 2 sisters, even as the anecdote dictated it. I just put the girls back on the horse, and I made it snow. Soon it was a blizzard, both on the page and in the accumulation of pages. For the first draft came quickly. I wrote 300 pages in 5 weeks. And both sisters had fallen for the teacher who unpinned them from the horse. The novel began in Oklahoma and ended up, perhaps like my doomed great-uncle, in Texas, stopping off very briefly in North Carolina before a long stint in Wyoming. But it is Lone Wolf, Oklahoma, a place I'd never visited until after I wrote the first draft, that shapes the sensibility of the sisters and therefore the novel. The shared sensibility of siblings and the forces that emerge to disrupt it as we age, politics, religion, geography, other people, is something that I've written about before, but not with such focus. The blanket the 2 girls share becomes a solar system whose stars are ever present above, even though the girls become women and mothers themselves and settle thousands of miles apart. They need only to look up to see the same twinkling planets. But looking up, remembering with the vigilance of the childhood imagination, a familiarity weakened by time, by choice, by circumstance, is difficult for us all. I stopped through Lone Wolf on my way from Texas to Wyoming in the fall of 2017. It was September, high summer still, and dry. In the Panhandle, tractors and combines worked the roadside fields, followed by billowing parachutes of dust. My GPS asked me to take a left not far outside of Lone Wolf. I always do what that crisp voice tells me to. And I ended up on a dirt road in the middle of a cotton field. Town appeared eventually in the distance, a few blocks of low buildings and modest vinyl-sided houses. I parked my car in front of the diner that had gone out of business with dishes still on the table. Mid-morning and crazy hot, and there was no one in sight. Finally, a car chugged up from the west. I kept window shopping along the mostly abandoned storefronts, but I heard the car brake. I looked over. A woman about my age was rolling down her window by hand. She was smoking the longest cigarette I've ever seen in my life. When the window was 3/4 open, she leaned out of it and said, "Well, are you here?" Had I the slightest doubt still that this story should have remained its original 3 pages, it disappeared in that second. You know, it actually got weirder. I said to her, "I'm here." "Yeah, I'm here." And she said, "Why are you here?" Which was kind of a good question, even though it's really lovely city, town. I mean, there are like 30 people there. And I said, "My grandmother is from here." And she said, "Oh, who's your grandmother? Who are your people?" I said, "Well, she left in 1918. And she said, "Well, what's her name?" And I said, "Hallie Haw." She goes, "Oh, yeah. I know her." So I thought, I don't know if I want to talk to everybody in this town or if I just want to kind of get back up to Wyoming. But it is interesting that sometimes happens. Fiction writers in the room, I attest to this, that you write about a place that you've never been, and then you go to that place, and it turns out that you've written like landscapes and even sort of buildings that turn out to be actually there, and your perception of the place, as I learned it from the mythology of my mother telling me about her grandmother, had established in my mind some sort of shape that turned out to be kind of exactly what it looked like. Anyway, I'm just going to read the first few pages and then stop. And it's from, there are 2 sisters on a horse, and the youngest one is named Elise, and the older one is named Lorena. Winter mornings, their mother kissed them both on the forehead, pinned the blanket around the 2 of them, and slapped the horse's croup. Lorena held the reins. Elise wrapped her arms around her older sister's waist, and both girls shut their eyes against the icy wind of the prairie. On the way to school, they recited items memorized from the pages of the Kiowa County News with accompanying commentary. Elise: Alfred von Tugen left Lone Wolf to attend OU Norman. He is one of our most brightest and most promising young men. Good luck to you, Alfred, in your studies. Lorena: Good luck, Alfred, outrunning the cow that licks your hair up to 5 times a day. Elise: Burr Wells, who owns one of the best farms that ever a crow flew over, says he has a set of farmers this year who are farmers in fact. He can't hardly get through praising his farmers. Lorena: It is a fact that farmers come in sets. Inside the blanket, they warmed themselves with words. The horse knew the way to the schoolhouse through the blinding snow. The teacher would be looking out for them. He would struggle into his coat and gloves and hat and come outside to unpin them. Off would fall the blanket, coated with ice crystals. Out would fall the words memorized from the newspaper. The teacher would shake the blanket, and the words from the newspaper would fall to the ground. The other words, not written, their words, along with their giggles, would float off into the snow. Lorena: While moving a cultivator plow last week near Gatiba, Eli Roberts was struck by the tongue of the machine, cutting an ugly gash under his chin and hurting him severely. The wound was dressed, and he is getting along nicely. Roberts now has it in for everything with a long tongue. Elise: Edith Gottswegen of Lone Wolf has been placed at the top of the list of long-tongue things he has it out for. Lorena: In for, I said, not out for. Elise: In for, out for. Lorena: Chapman Huff had business in Oklahoma City. Elise: I bet he did Chapman Huff. Lorena laughed. Through the blanket, Elise saw her laughter leak out and lessen the menace of the wind. When the teacher, who was new that year, unpinned the blanket, Elise saw the comma separating the dids disappear into the snow. I bet he did, she whispered to Lorena. And the new school teacher, whose name was Mr. McQueen, shook his head and said, You too, as he helped first Lorena and then Elise off the horse. On the first day they arrived by blanket, Mr. McQueen asked what their horse was called. They'd been riding into school every day for months. but now that Mr. McQueen had to unpin them, he wanted to greet the horse by name. "His name is Sandy," said Elise. Mr. McQueen looked distressed. Elise assumed it was because Sandy was the color of tar. "He would like to live by the sea." "He does live by the sea, actually. He gallops through tidal pools." "I understand," said Mr. McQueen, who seemed to have recovered. He introduced himself properly to Sandy and asked if he might accompany him to the shore. He had come from somewhere back east, and Elise assumed he knew the ocean, but when asked during geography, he said he knew only rivers. He described crossing the Mississippi by train on his way west. He crossed at Vicksburg, where boys stood by the river in knickers stiff with mud. For a nickel, these boys would tie ropes around their waists and wade into the river and stick their hands in the holes in the bank and pull out catfish. He told the story of a man named Charlie Carter who sat beside him for 3 days snoring drunk. Finally, in Arkansas, he woke up calling for his Beulah girl. All the boys and most of the girls thought this was hilarious, but Elise found it tragic. His Beulah girl having married another, Charlie Carter having drunk himself into a 3-state slumber, so sick was he over the events that had befallen him. "Oh, Beulah girl," cried Charlie Carter. Elise sat in the middle of the classroom studying Mr. McQueen. With her most woeful expression, she implored him to understand Charlie Carter's predicament. "Have you nothing in your body but funny bone?" Mr. McQueen caught her staring. He returned her stare as he talked to the Natchez Trace, which he claimed to be a path of prehistoric animals before Indians found it and then white men. He talked on a bit, and then he called on her. "Reverend Womack closed the meeting at Bethel Sunday early due to heavy rain," said Elise, quoting the Kiowa County News. Elise felt her sister's tickling giggle as if they were still tinted atop Sandy. She looked outside. The wind had blown open the door to the storm cellar. Edith Gottswegen stuck out her too long tongue. Eli Roberts had it in for her and out for her. "Oh, we did." "Beg pardon," said Mr. McQueen. The class was silent. They knew her to sometimes answer questions with quotes from the newspaper. She did it to them and to the teachers, also to her piano instructor. Her classmates stared at their teacher. They were blind to commas adrift among the ice crystals, and their stony hearts were immune to Charlie Carter's loss of his Beulah girl. She looked outside again, but the snow was too thick to see the storm cellar. Sandy galloped along the edge of the surf. Waves lapped at his hooves. He smiled, tickled. She smiled, tickled. A pelican lit on Sandy, the very spot where Elise had sat clutching her sister the 4 frigid miles to school. Among the most interesting relics owned by Captain James Lowry of Missouri, currently visiting his son in Lone Wolf, is a stout old-fashioned hickory walking cane, said Elise. The stick was cut and used for some time by Henry Clay, coming from the Clay home in Kentucky. "Elise," whispered her sister, "that is a long way for a cane to travel. It must be very stout," said Mr. McQueen, who did not call on her again that day. Thank you very much. This came verbatim out of the newspaper. Burr Wells, who owns one of the best farms that ever a crow flew over, says he has a set of farmers this year who are farmers in fact. He can't hardly get through praising his farmers. Now, if you read that in the Austin American Statesman, you'd be a little freaked out probably. But then if you read it again, you would see the incredible colloquial beauty of it. And then the other thing I want to say is I got obsessed with this one paper in Oklahoma, and I kept reading, and I kept finding all these places where, so my father was a newspaper man, and it was it was a family thing. We all 5 of us kids had to go down every Wednesday and put the paper out. I was the circulation manager. My brother was in charge of advertising. My little sister helped lay the paper out, and we all rolled them up and put them in sacks and took them to the post office. And we were all like 12. We had no business doing this. But one of the things that I had to do was go around and collect. And that was absolutely the worst job, was to go around and ask people for money, you know, at age 12. So this guy, this editor, had this ingenious thing where he would actually write, and I just flat out stole it and put it in the book. He would put these little stories, like insets, into the copy. And you would be reading an article, and then there would be this little inset. And this one is called Told in a Dream. A farmer had a dream. He dreamed that he had raised 1,000 bushels of wheat, and he was happy over the fact. Then he dreamed that he sold his wheat for $1 a bushel, and his happiness was great. But now he dreamed that he had sold it to 1,000 different people, a bushel to each person, and that nobody paid him, and he was sad. When he awoke, it was broad daylight, and leaping out of bed, he exclaimed to his wife, "Rebecca, I have had a solemn warning, and I know the meaning of it. I am going right off to town and pay the editor the $1 I owe him for the newspaper." I think it's good to end with someone else's words. Thank you very much.